Everyone. Today we're lucky enough to have two leading experts on Venezuela. I think between them they probably have more experience studying Venezuela than years I've been alive. Just to my left is...
I think I do.
Well,
alone.
Fair enough. To my left is Mike McCarthy. He's a research fellow at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at AU, and an adjunct professor at GW's Elliott School for International Affairs. He specializes in South American politics, U.S., Latin American relations, democratization, populism, contentious politics, and media balance and bias. He founded and manages Caracas Wire, a newsletter on Venezuelan politics. To my right is David Smilody. He's a senior fellow here at WOLA, specializing in Venezuela. He's also the Charles and Leo M. Favreau Professor of Human Relations at Tulane University, and he moderates the Venezuela Politics and Human Rights blog. His research focuses on social movements, human rights, and culture in Venezuela. And so, I think the title of our event today, Contending with Crisis, says a lot. Venezuela's crisis has implications both domestically for Venezuela as well as for the international community. If presidential elections move forward on April 22nd as planned, it's very likely that they'll take place under fraudulent conditions. And, this poses challenges both for Venezuelans and for the international community. For Venezuelans, the question is, does participating in these elections risk legitimizing the government's authoritarian slide? Is it worth participating if only to document a lack of transparency? And for the international community, struggling to respond to the crisis, the question is how to pressure the government into some kind of solution to the crisis while also avoiding any impact on the Venezuelan people. With that, I think we're gonna just the format here. I'm gonna let Mike talk first, then we're gonna have David, and then we'll do rounds of Q&A, and I'll ask everybody to speak loud and clear, though this is a relatively small space. We'll do as many rounds as we can as time allows. So with that, I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to WOLA for the invitation to be here again. And it's always a pleasure to present on a panel with David. We've known each other for a very long time, and we always have, I think, a very good complementary approach to things. So I look forward to the conversation. And also a special note, I really want to congratulate WOLA on continuing to do a great job offering high-quality analysis, contextualized, which for the Venezuelan situation is not easy. So congratulations on continuing to do that, and I hope that the blog and your work continues for a number of years going forward. So what I want to do today, ladies and gentlemen, is talk to you about what I think is Venezuela's multiplying crisis. And I think that the multiplication of the crisis is taking place in all arenas, and so therefore there's a way in which everything is getting worse. And I think that this raises a number of big challenges, both for how the international community approaches the question of crisis resolution over the long term, and also in the near term, what the political scenarios are for the actors in country. And I'm going to talk, therefore, about the broader situation of the crisis, and elections will be situated in that conversation. And I think that's relevant, as you'll see in the context of my presentation, because I think that regardless of what happens on April 22nd, all the scenarios are still open the day after. So I think that's important to keep in mind regardless of the election itself. So what I'm going to do is start at the street level of this crisis and try and give us some basic conditions for thinking about the problems that are at stake in Venezuela today. So as many of you undoubtedly know, Venezuela is an oil state, and it depends on oil for over 95% of its fiscal income. This captures the, can I have the pointer please? Yes, thanks. This captures the, this is oil prices over time. Let's see if this is gonna do its thing. Where are we? pointer?
I've seen it.
Okay. So this captures oil prices over time, and I've put here the two vertical lines to capture the major changes in terms of the rise and the decline, right? And here we are today to your right. And oil prices have recovered a little bit in 2017, and 2018 we have unclear about where the projection is going to be, but things at least look somewhat stable from the market's perspective. That recovery in oil prices might have been more valuable to stabilizing the situation in Venezuela if the country wasn't experiencing an almost complete collapse in the oil sector. Okay, so this graph captures, at least in the last 6 months, the decline in Venezuela's oil production, as well as the level of imports to the United States of Venezuelan crude. And I'll unpack this slide in a second. But first, I want you to appreciate the fact that Venezuela has experienced a decline in their production, first of over 10%, then of over 13%, and then from 2017 to 2018, there's a chance that the decline in oil production could be greater than 25%. And if the country ends up producing less than 2 million barrels a day, that would be the first time since, I think, before 1990 that Venezuela has produced less than 2 million barrels a day. So this is a completely different situation even than during the Chavez period, in which there were problems in the oil sector, but they weren't not nearly this bad. And the big question here is whether or not the imposition of U.S. sanctions have had a dramatic impact on the level of U.S. imports of Venezuelan crude. So the thin red line here in August 17 represents the time in which the executive order was placed or issued for sanctions on the financial front. And there's been some periods of decline in terms of the monthly flows of crude oil to the United States. But the overall trend line more or less tracks out with the changing levels of Venezuelan production. So there's nothing particularly dramatic yet. January was the lowest month, but the numbers so far for February suggest that they could recover a little bit. Given the picture in the oil sector, it's unlikely that there's going to be some type of stabilization to Venezuela's depression anytime soon. The IMF is predicting that the economy will decline again over 10%, and then in 2019 the same. It seems as though the transition from Mac to PC lost the value there for 2 years. And then, in addition to the situation on the oil front, as you all undoubtedly know, the country is now formally experiencing hyperinflation. So this is the monthly rate of inflation in 2017, and then 1 month of January, as calculated by the opposition-controlled National Assembly. Of course, there are no official statistics any longer in Venezuela, so we have to rely on secondary sources. And this context of the inflation is significant also for the everyday Venezuelan, obviously. So even more serious than the level of the changes in prices is what people are dealing with in trying to obtain a basic basket of goods. So as measured by a Venezuelan organization connected to a labor union, Senda, year on year from December of 2016 to December of 2017, the increase in the cost of a basic basket of goods is 1,800%. Okay, and in December, it was necessary for a family of 5 to have the income level of 60 minimum wages to be able to cover the cost of a basic basket of goods. Okay, and month to month from November to December, the increase was 96%, which is the largest registered in Venezuela in the last, I think, 20 years, according to Senda. So this is on top of the problems with shortages and the lack of a real social assistance plan from the government to create some level of crisis alleviation. At the end of 2017 and coming into this year, these problems with hyperinflation resulted in the reemergence of social unrest in the form of very intense protest over goods shortages and food shortages. And this is important, this image is important because looking at sort of things in perspective, this is more a portrait of what protest looks like today than compared to last year when we were thinking mostly about a political protest, right? It's not to say that one is, that they just have different characteristics, right? And they have different intensities in terms of how they have to be dealt with. Now, the arguably most troubling aspect of social unrest is that it's taking the form of lootings, which is not new in Venezuela. But in January of 2018, according to a Venezuelan NGO called the Venezuelan Observatory of Social Conflict, there were 140 attempted or successful lootings. Okay? This is more than 5 times the number of lootings registered in January of 2017. This is a month-by-month comparison. Obviously, it's only one data point, but it is nonetheless very significant that there would be lootings during this time of the year, because the government traditionally has prioritized imports around the Christmas period to try and create some level of Christmas cheer among the population. This year, they failed. And in fact, it backfired. The government backfired in the sense that Maduro promised that there would be Christmas ham for the people. That was never delivered, and this is part of what was behind the sharp increase in lootings and social protests in January. In addition to these protest conditions, we have ongoing social suffering at the level of the public health situation with maternal and infant deaths, and then also a serious problem with child malnutrition, which is being tracked by Caritas International. So all these sort of background, all pieces of context are relevant to me in terms of the timing of December and January, because I think they played a role in the decision of the government to call the elections in an accelerated, fast-track manner earlier than normally happens in Venezuela. Okay? In other words, the government woke up in 2018 and said, well, we weren't able to deliver any Christmas cheer. Looking out, we have a lot of bond payments to make in the second half of 2018. How are we going to make it through the year with a campaign, which will be costly, right? And do the other things that we need to do to make it through. So I think this was a part of the reason why the decision was accelerated to April. The discussion with the opposition had entailed a number of different dates, most of them in the first half of 2018, which itself is a major change because traditionally in Venezuelan politics, presidential elections are held in December. The last presidential was an exception because of Chavez's cancer. So they moved the calendar up for October in that specific election event. So I think that background of the crisis is part of what has been driving the political situation. And that's going to raise an important question that we'll try and come back to in the context of the scenarios, which is that even if the government, or if Maduro is declared the winner of the April 22nd vote, how in fact are they going to be able to hold on to power going forward, right? We've been asking this question for a long time, true, but the conditions are increasingly worse, so I think it's getting even harder for them. This graph is of the last 3 votes that have been contested by the opposition, 2013, 2015, and 2017. The blue being the opposition and the red being the pro-government vote. And it was a presidential, legislative, and a gubernatorial vote. So you would expect the overall vote shares to be lower for turnout in the gubernatorial. But this change here, in terms of the government being on top, is quite significant because it's suggesting somehow that the opposition is having trouble, even under very difficult campaign conditions, getting back to the levels of popularity that it was able to obtain in previous elections. And that has to do with the extremely tough environment in which the opposition is working, and the fact that they haven't been able to do a very good job of choosing a leader and getting on the same page to create the perception that they are a credible alternative to the government. But I'd be happy to talk about the question of participation in the April 22nd vote in the Q&A. So after the announcement of the elections, my read of the situation was that the chances for the negotiations that had been taking place in the Dominican Republic to be successful declined significantly. For the opposition to not be able to have a more than, say, 3 or 4 month period to campaign while the government knows exactly what it's going to do was basically unacceptable. So the opposition saw out the process at the negotiating table for a lot of reasons, including international support, and there's also an important narrative that is constructed in the context of negotiations about who in fact is to blame for their breakdown or for their success. But to me, it was going to be very difficult after Diosdado Cabello, the president of the National Constituent Assembly, announced that elections would definitely be held, at least in the first, before April 30th of 2018, right? That restricted the options considerably for the opposition, which, just to underscore the point again, remember, its top 2 candidates cannot run for political office, right? Enrique Capriles and Leopoldo Lopez. So that ties their hands significantly to begin with. Okay, so just to talk about the international level, and then I'll wrap up with a brief discussion of the scenarios. So U.S. policy has evolved in the context of how to find resolution to this crisis. At one point, I would say there was diplomacy, then it was more a period of targeted sanctions, and then essentially since the transition from Obama to Trump, I would say that we've been in an area that I've described as coercive diplomacy. And this means trying to turn the screws on the government through a variety of mechanisms, from condemning them, sanctioning them, through various legal options that the U.S. government has, and also using economic tools to try and change the situation in Venezuela. And the strategic objective of sanctions, from the U.S.'s perspective, is to try and create divisions within Chavismo. Now, there is a hearty debate about whether or not the sanctions are in fact successful. There is a way in which they also raise the exit costs for regime players, but there also is some evidence, I think, that they have produced some divisions within the government. A couple of years ago, it may have been hard for us to imagine that the Attorney General of Venezuela would have broken from the government. Now, you can say that that had to do with Maduro's authoritarian overreach when he basically shut down the National Assembly by calling on the Supreme Court to issue a number of decisions which assert its authorities. That's true, but there also is a broader context in which sanctions, I think, are creating pressure. And the strategic objective, again, is to create division with Chavismo, which brings us back to a very big question with the Trump administration and with Trump himself, which is, to what extent is it possible to think about this administration moving from a period of trying to gain leverage over the situation to trying to cut a deal of some sort? And it's looking like it could be difficult to imagine a deal, given some of the recent comments from Secretary Tillerson and the overall message coming from the State Department and the administration more broadly during his trip to, during Tillerson's trip to Latin America. I at first thought that Tillerson's comment during his speech at the University of Texas Austin about a military coup against the Maduro government was just an offhanded comment. Subsequently, however, Marco Rubio went on Twitter and publicly endorsed the idea, and then there have been sort of a growing chorus of U.S. foreign policy analysts suggesting that a military coup option would not be the worst thing that could take place. I think that this is quite reckless, and I think that this is ultimately going to be counterproductive for U.S. Interest, and also for helping to move the dial forward in trying to find creative solutions for creating pressure on the government. I should say that despite the more collective hard line from the Trump administration, there are ongoing efforts still to try and create a multilateral coalition of countries that are working on different fronts to pressure the Maduro government, right? So we recently saw, I think it was yesterday and confirmed this morning, at least in the press, that Mexico is going to undertake some efforts to try and work with Caribbean countries to see if they can rethink their relationships with Venezuela. And obviously the Mexicans have been working more or less in coordination with the Trump administration. So it's not as though the U.S. has completely given up on diplomacy, more that there seems to be a division of labor that involves the U.S. doing sort of the harsher stuff in terms of the sanction tools, and other players both in Latin America and Europe working along different lines. At the same time, it's important to recognize that countries in Latin America, such as Chile, and then also Canada and the European Union, have imposed sanctions on Venezuela. So we're not talking about a unilateral package at this moment. So there's also a question of, well, to what extent does this pressure create a situation in which the Maduro government's traditional backers, China and Russia, play a role in counterbalancing the pressure from Western democracies, right? Is that taking place? And I'm not sure that we can say yet that they've come in to save the day for Maduro, but it is important to keep in mind first why they're still there supporting him. And this is my reading of it, which is that first, these governments have sunk costs. They've been working with the Venezuelan government for a long time, and they'd rather try and salvage what they can to try and keep the situation and their investments secure to some extent. Also, there's the question of why would you change your position if you're Russia and China at this point, given that the opposition has yet to fully prove itself as demonstrating its capacity as a governing coalition, even from the position of an opposition. And then I think there are some important geopolitical considerations. One is Schadenfreude, which is that both of these countries take some pleasure from creating headaches for the United States in its traditional sphere of influence. And on that specific point, coming back to Tillerson's speech at the University of Texas of Austin, he specifically said that China was now trying to assert itself in Latin America and treat Latin America as its sphere of influence. And he suggested that the region doesn't need any new imperial powers. This was a pretty strong remark in the context of U.S.-China relations, in fact. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not it causes the Chinese to, in some way, help Maduro out more than they would have before. I still think that's unlikely because the Chinese are in this for the long run, and they are aware of the problems at the level of the economy, and it doesn't seem likely to me that they're going to throw good money after bad. So one scenario that would be positive for Maduro would be a level of support that would provide lifelines, but wouldn't necessarily bail him out of the situation, right? Which is an important distinction to draw given the economic problems in the country. And then just to wrap up, and be happy to talk about this more during the Q&A, is that regardless, like I said, of what happens on April 22nd, all the scenarios are open. And I think that we should think about these scenarios in a very broad sense, right? So change, continuity, and consolidation. Briefly, what do I mean by these three C's? So change could in fact entail a continuing Chavista government, right? Just because there is a change doesn't mean there has to be a transition to the opposition. So I'm using the term analytically. right? So there could be some type of palace coup or rebranding process within Chavismo. That's one possibility. And there's also the possibility that there is an interim government in the context of regime collapse. And then there's also the possibility that somehow the opposition participates April 22nd and a miracle happens, right? Which is unlikely, but a miracle could happen, right? At the level of a crisis on election day, right? I don't see a scenario in which the opposition goes to the polls and wins. I can imagine a scenario, though, in which their participation raises the cost of fraud for the government, and that creates a new crisis for the regime. So those are a couple of ways to think about change. Continuity for me would be Maduro being declared the winner, but not being able to really assert his authority both within the governing coalition and over society. And then consolidation would be Maduro being declared the winner, and the government successfully creating a new policy regime for it to work with international investors, China and Russia, and then finding a way to somehow stabilize the economy. And there is, I have to say, a very troubling scenario there for the possibility of consolidation. And that, in some ways, is evoked by this image. Many of you have probably seen news reports in the last week or so about the levels of Venezuelan migrants moving into Colombia and also in Brazil. And one scenario in which the government would be in a better position to consolidate is, quite frankly, is if they had to govern with a smaller population. So Venezuela has a population of 30 million. The estimates for the diaspora community is somewhere between like 2 and 4 million. It's obviously difficult to pin the numbers down because of the fact that it's hard to track people and so on and so forth. But to me, you know, the nightmare scenario that keeps me up at night is the possibility that there's a mass exodus of the Venezuelan population, and that creates an opening, if you will, for the Maduro government to fully consolidate its control. So I'll end there.
Okay.
Should I go back to the last where we started?
Okay, and so just, is there a clicker or something? Oh,
Yeah,
do it over there?
Unfortunately, it's all the way over here, but I
Yeah, I don't need the slides clicked, so there's not that many. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming out. This is a great turnout, and we're especially happy to see on the RSVP list the number of people from the international community here, the foreign embassies in Washington. And that's because WOLA, in contrast to some of the other think tanks in town, does not consider itself as a satellite of the U.S. government or a research institute providing the U.S. government with information, but rather as a partner to human rights groups in the region and as a partner to the international community that wants to think about the region. So that includes the United States government, but it also includes other governments as well as the international media and other international partners. So it's especially good, and in light of that, if you could, I thought I would focus my comments today on exactly what the international community can do, or what it really is doing, and provide sort of constructive critique of what's going on and some suggestions of paths forward. The sort of the most important tool right now that the international community is using with reference to Venezuela is the sanctions regime. Sanctions here at WOLA, we have actively opposed sanctions in the case of Venezuela, especially unilateral sanctions, for the past 3.5 years since this was first suggested. And that was not because we have a principled objection to sanctions, but we have a principled suspicion of sanctions, and that is because the research on sanctions is quite clear that most of the time they do not work. And so, and we think that, and indeed, the sanctions program that was rolled out in March 2015 was not constructive and considerably complicated the country and is partially responsible for the democratic deterioration of Venezuela. That said, the situation has dramatically, it is what it is, it's dramatically deteriorated in the past year, and I think some more these kind of measures are more appropriate now. Probably the most important thing that has happened with sanctions over the past year is the fact that they've become multilateral. The research on sanctions shows that one of the most important characteristics of this minority of sanctions programs that actually have a positive impact is that they're multilateral. We would have preferred that a sanctions program had come from the United Nations or come from the OAS, but in lieu of that, we're happy to see this year that European Union, Canada, and in part Mexico and some other actors are considering it as well. Sanctions have taken on a more multilateral character. That both gives them more legitimacy and it gives them much more effectiveness. It's just more difficult to sort of dismiss sanctions as a conspiracy when you have a significant part of the international community participating in them, and they're simply more effective. To say that for a Venezuelan official who suddenly can't go to Disney World, might think, well, I can go to Disney World Paris or something. But now it's like you can't go to Europe either. That's actually a pretty significant increase in the effectiveness of sanctions. The other thing that makes sanctions, or that determines whether a sanction program is actually effective or not, is whether there's a clear way that sanctions can be lifted. If there's no way that, if the sanctions are sort of a dead-end street and there's no way of going back, of course they're not going to produce any change in conduct or change in course. So only sanctions that actually can be lifted, and so this is something that we thought was a positive attribute of the sanctions. Basically, let me take a step back. The two sort of sanctions programs that have come out in Venezuela are the targeted sanctions. There are sanctions against officials that are involved in corruption or human rights abuses, and more recently sanctions on the issuing of new debt that came from the United States. These latter sanctions, we think, have the attribute, and that it's quite clear how the Venezuelan government can actually get around them. They can get around them by sending their debt through the National Assembly. But that leads to the third point, and this is the point that I've been trying to focus on in my various conversations in town this week, and that is a successful sanctions program has to have a clear communication strategy. It has to be a clear and strategic communications campaign. First of all, of course, as I just mentioned, what needs to be done for them to be lifted? That has to be absolutely clear, not just to the officials that are sanctioned, but to every stakeholder that's involved. This has to be clear, for example, to the Venezuelan in the street, what it means for these officials to be sanctioned and what they could do. If they could do A, B, and C and get out from these sanctions, well, that creates more pressure on them from the Venezuelan population. Communications, for example, as I mentioned, that financial sanctions should be or can be circumvented. That is almost completely unknown. It's just considered to be sanctions on Venezuela, on the issuing of new Venezuelan debt. Now Venezuela is going to default, but actually they could get around this, and that has to be common knowledge. It has to be common knowledge that the Maduro government is going into default by choice because they don't want to work through with the National Assembly. And there's a big problem going on, and this is a very serious issue with a lot of sanctions programs, with overcompliance. If you are a bank or a financial institution, you're not going to assign a team to spend 6 months on each case of a financial transaction to figure out whether it is going to fall under sanctions policy. You're going to play it conservative. Anything that smells of possible sanctions, you're just going to reject it. So this is having a huge impact. It's making what should be a scalpel into a chainsaw. And this is a problem, and it's making these debt sanctions that were issued in August. It's making them almost into general economic sanctions, and that's a very, very negative thing. Beyond that, we've heard from regional human rights groups in Venezuela, that they're having a hard time to getting supplies into Venezuela, medical supplies, because of overcompliance. That seems absolutely bizarre, because the sanctions actually say this does not have to do with humanitarian aid, etc. But if you're a bank and you get these documents in, you're going to play it safe, and you're going to reduce the costs on your staff, and you're going to just favor overcompliance to sanctions. So these are communications issues. These things have to be communicated absolutely, with absolute clarity to all stakeholders, what sanctions cover, what they do, what they don't cover. Otherwise, it's going to undermine them as a tool. Okay, so could you go back one slide a second? What I'm going to be doing here is talking first about different techniques of pressure, and then I'm going to be talking about engagement. Okay, you can go ahead. Okay, the other sort of element of pressure that has been going on over the past year that has actually probably been more influential on the Maduro government than sanctions has been the lack of recognition. And this is, 2017 I think was a terrible year for all of us that, our stakeholders or have followed Venezuela over the years. But there are a couple things that were quite positive. The development of multilateralism was positive, despite setbacks in the OAS effort to use the democratic charter. After the Constituent Assembly election at the end of July, in early August, the Lima Group emerged. This group of 12 countries in Latin America, and more recently it's become 14, that rejected this Constituent Assembly. And in fact, across the globe, more than 40 countries have also rejected or not recognized this Constituent Assembly. This is something that has really taken aback the Maduro government. It was something they did not expect, and it's something that has complicated their plans. If you have noticed, the Constituent Assembly has not had the big protagonistic role that they anticipated, that a lot of us anticipated that it was going to have. It's kind of a tool, a second fiddle to the Maduro government, and they use it when they need it. But it hasn't had, and that's because it is really hard to have it become this preeminent branch of government when it's not recognized by most of the relevant countries in the international community. I think this also is probably the most important tool going forward. The threat of not recognizing the presidential election. That is a really important, ominous thing for the Maduro government, and it's something that's going to really complicate them after the April 22 election. And I think that's probably the strongest tool. And so I'm glad to see that the Lima Group has emphasized this fact in the past week. I should say that the lack of recognition is not a synonym of isolation. I think isolation is a term that's used too much in international relations. I think it's clear, that I should say the context of this. The Lima Group this past week also said that Peru disinvited Maduro to the Summit of the Americas, and this is something that's clearly a stinging rebuke of the Maduro government, and that hurts. In fact, he actually said, "I'm going to go anyway, crawl through the window or whatever." But that's not going to happen. But it shows that they're not happy about it. This is a really stinging rebuke. But it also means that it's more difficult for other countries to engage Venezuela. I personally think it would have been just as effective for Maduro to go and receive the rebuke of 12 to 14 Lima Group countries there, face-to-face around the table. I think that would have been just as effective. And you can also have more positive exchange. You want to have, I guess I'm a sociologist here thinking, but you always want to have not just isolation and pressure. You also want to have positive engagement that can create channels in solutions. Okay. So I've talked a bit about pressure, and here as well, I think the terms pressure and isolation are overused in international relations. I think they're the favored metaphors, but I think they have to be complemented by the idea of engagement. And we've seen this already. There is this underway. There's been mediation. I think the mediation in the Dominican Republic has been. I think that there's been some significant improvement over the past in this round. That by which I mean starting in December. With the different representatives of the region participating in this. I think the quality of the discussion, the concreteness of the discussion, was I think a big improvement over previous efforts at mediation. And I don't think that this is over. I don't think this is done. Talks are currently suspended. And it's hard to imagine right now how there could be any solution, but this is all lying in the way. And I think this kind of mediation, it's hard to imagine any kind of solution to the Venezuelan crisis without this kind of mediation. And that leads to another issue, which I think the international community has not done enough on yet. No, there have been some discussions about this, and in fact, the opposition had a legislative project last May, but then of course they got distracted with other things. But and this is the issue of transitional justice. The basic goal, the most fundamental goal of the idea of transitional justice, not justice in general, but transitional justice, is to reduce the threat felt by those clinging to power, because there's a structural problem. You can have people, that might be willing to let go of power because they know they're making a mess of things, and they know that people really dislike them, but they're afraid of what's going to happen to them if they do let go of power. And so transitional justice is a mechanism by which you can come up with plans that somehow move between the extremes of a witch hunt and impunity, And so in places like Colombia, South Africa, transitional justice programs were key. Without those, it's hard to imagine that those conflicts could have had the progress and solution that they had. This type of thing has to happen in Venezuela. I don't have a specific recommendation, but there's got to be more push, more willingness to work on this, because without mediation, without transitional justice, it's hard to imagine a solution. There's not going to be. This is not a government that's just going to end, or a situation that's just going to end with an electoral solution. Okay, we lost. Here you go, guys. Here are the keys. No, it's not going to happen that way. It's going to have to happen through some sort of brokered type of pact or deal that will likely involve some sort of election, but it's also going to have some kind of mediation and some kind of transitional justice to actually make it happen. There's so much tension, so much conflict, so much resentment within Venezuela that's hard to imagine without it. Finally, there's a couple of ineffective measures that I think should be talked about. In Secretary Tillerson's visit to the region, the most talked about measure was the idea of oil sanctions, that the United States could prohibit some kind of oil imports or oil exports to Venezuela. What he means by that are exports of light crude that is necessary to actually even process Venezuelan heavy crude. I think this would be really a terrible idea. I think it would affect the population more than the government. The government's going to eat well no matter what happens, and it's basically going to give them a proportionally bigger impact on the distribution of scarce goods than they already have. I think it could cause an even greater economic and refugee crisis than we're seeing right now. And I think it will simply help the government deflect the blame for economic failures. And I should mention that and this goes back to the communication thing as well. The Maduro government is winning the communications battle about sanctions. The polling data from December show that the current debt sanctions are unpopular. They are opposed by a majority of Venezuelans. They, even among people in the opposition, there's more people that oppose them than support them. That's the December data. And from what I hear, the murmurings from pollsters that I hear is that has spiked since then. Things have really dramatically deteriorated since December economically, and the Maduro government mentions economic sanctions every single day, and so people really are starting to associate their problems with these kind of sanctions. And I think oil sanctions would make it even clearer. Financial sanctions people kind of don't quite understand. That helps them out, the Maduro government, but every Venezuelan alive understands oil and the need to export oil to the United States, and that would be just perfect to deflect blame for economic failures. Finally, the threats of armed engagement. The threats of armed engagement, of course, can generate a self-fulfilling prophecy within the U.S. government. That's what we saw with Iraq. It seemed like a ridiculous proposal when it had been first rolled out in 2002, but by the end of 2002, it seemed like an unstoppable steamroller. So these threats of armed engagement in Venezuela, I think, are very unwelcome. But there's another effect that I think should be underlined that I think probably is not often understood. If you think about the opposition, the Venezuelan opposition, everybody knows that it's divided, it's dysfunctional. The basic lines of the division have been pretty similar. The division that runs through opposition have been pretty similar since about 2004, and that is between abstentionists and electoralists, the people who think The electorals are the people who think that there is an electoral solution to what's going on in Venezuela. The abstentionists are those who think there is not, and that you can't legitimize this government by participating. After the 2004 referendum, which Chavez won by a landslide, there was disinformation that had been that had been fraud. The opposition did not participate in the regional election of 2004, nor the legislative election of 2005. That was an absolute disaster. Basically, from 2007 through 2015, the electoralists had the upper hand. But now it's quite clear, mainly because of the behavior of the Electoral Council, that the abstentionists have the upper hand. But if you think about abstentionist theory, you talk to somebody who really supports abstention, talk to Maria Corina Machado or somebody else like that, and they say, you can't vote, no, we just got to go out on the streets. And it's like, well, that's happened before. How's that, sometimes I think they think it's going to be like, playing the trumpets and marching around Jericho until the walls fall down. It just doesn't work. So you often wonder, well, what's the end theory of change there? And oftentimes you don't have one, but one that does actually work in that theory is military intervention. And oftentimes that is an implicit, unstated premise of this. So when you have the president of an important country in the region saying, "Oh, we have a military option," what does that do? It strengthens the abstentionist wing of the opposition. It makes it a more plausible theory, And so I think the threats of armed engagement, or the suggestion of a military option that President Trump made in August, I think also had an impact on the reduced, or on the inability of the opposition to actually turn their people out. And I think the division since then, the sort of strength that the abstentionists have, I think, is in part, and it's hard for people, I think, in this town to understand just how seriously Venezuelans think that this is a possibility. I mean, I think most people here in town say, "Oh, come on, the U.S. government's never going to pay the political cost to invade Venezuela." But a lot of people in Venezuela's opposition actually think, "Oh, the U.S. would do us this favor. This is a possibility. Just send in the Marines, get rid of these people, and we'll rebuild." That is a plausible theory to a lot of Venezuelans' opposition. And so saying something like this has a huge impact on the debate and the discussion inside the opposition. Okay, I think that's it. We can just open it up.
Thank you. So before we open it up for questions, I just wanted to make, just take advantage of the fact that I'm sitting here and ask one of my own. Or more of a comment, actually. I feel like April 23rd is kind of an open question. Touching on the regional pressure that you mentioned and the idea of non-recognition that you talked about, David. It's one thing for the region to reject the Constituent Assembly, and another, I feel like, to reject a government that maintains its hold on power through fraudulent elections. In talking to representatives of governments like Uruguay, for instance, if you talk to Uruguayans in government, they'll say, like, yeah, we don't recognize the Constituent Assembly, but we're not making it public because, we don't expect them to recognize our Ministry of Agriculture, And I just wonder if going into these elections, and if they do occur, the rejection of these election results takes on an added weight in the region, and sort of the importance of that versus anything we've seen so far. So just something I wanted to put a pin in for both of you. Now I'll open it up to the rest of you and ask you to introduce yourself, state your name and affiliation, and then ask your question. We'll just take maybe 2 right now and then go into a couple more rounds. And in the back.
Sure. Good morning, Alex Sanchez, I'm a defense analyst and geopolitics too. I actually have 2 questions. One, what are civil-military relations like nowadays in Venezuela? General Padrino Lopez just came out a couple of weeks ago when Secretary Peterson was in Latin America and said that, that Venezuela will not recognize any kind of foreign intervention in our national affairs. Out there, the U.S. say that we're not democratic, we're having elections in a month. So, like you were talking about, Michael, even if there's elections tomorrow and the opposition wins, the ministries are very heavily, Chavista, they have that kind of ideology. So how are some relations nowadays, and how could we expect them to behave after the election? That's question 1. And question 2, when you talk about migration, there are a lot of Venezuelans going to Colombia, to Brazil, and Peruvian. There are a lot in Peru too. I was there in Christmas. I've never had arepa in Miraflores, and I can buy one. That's a new thing, I guess. So all these migrants are leaving Venezuela, and they vote. And they vote in the elections. But and how, even if they cannot vote, how do you reconcile that with that abstention theory that David was talking about? If 1 million people don't vote, well, does that mean that they will have voted for the opposition, or is it because that's a message to the Venezuelan government? If you can talk more about that, that would be great. Thank you.
Any questions in this round? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Lady Amuni with the U.S. Institute of Peace. You mentioned opportunities for some level of positive engagement as part of a transition plan. I mean, including mediation and transitional justice mechanisms. How likely is that to happen in the current scenario and in a potential transition or change scenario?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Those are 3 great questions. Is that Alex or Alexi? Sorry.
Alex.
Alex, thank you. So, the civil-military front. First, I'll tell you a little bit about how I think about the military in the context of Venezuelan politics. So, to me, the military has always been Chavismo's core coalition. And what I mean by that is that it's the strategic fulcrum for the government to make moves. It also is a conglomerate of interests, right? And so it's hard to know when the military starts and when the military ends, because you have active and retired officials, right, who in one way or another are linked to the military as an institution, right? There is no such thing as a retired military official, right? There's a reason for that saying. And so I think it's very difficult to draw the lines between civil and military in the first place. But beyond quibbling a little bit with your premise, I do want to try and answer your question. And that is that at the moment, it seems as though there aren't any real divisions within the military. And I think that the comments by Secretary Tillerson are counterproductive in the sense that any members of the military conglomerate of interest that could have been open to conversations with the opposition or other folks in society may now be more concerned about a purge that could be coming down as a result of the fact that it seems to me that if I was in the shoes of the Venezuelan military hierarchy, I would be preparing for efforts to foment a coup in Venezuela, given the way that ideologically the Venezuelan military thinks about the world and sees the United States in this sort of same Cold War lens as the Latin American left actually always has in some ways, right? So I think that is significant. And then at the timing question, coming back to why April 22nd for the date for the presidential, right? It's also significant that the period for promotions within the military is June and July, right? So after the vote would set up a scenario in which Maduro would be in a position to, use all the power and symbolism of the state to name a new top brass within the armed forces. So I think that's also relevant, and that's when that situation normally heats up in terms of tensions between civil and military, because you have various turf wars that always erupt about my group from my generation and at the academy and so on and so forth like that. So we'll have to wait and see a little bit on that front. And as far as the migration question and being able to vote, so the government, like many other governments in the world, is using sort of the same playbook as ever, which is it takes a very hard line about something, and then it tries to back off that hard line and make itself appear as though it is making a concession, right? So recently Maduro said that they would lengthen the period for being able to enroll in the polls to be registered to vote, and that he would open the Miami consulate so that Venezuelans abroad would be able to vote. These are not really concessions, right? Because why would Maduro be the one naming these things? right? How can you, where's the institutional sort of process there if you have the president, the incumbent president, saying that he'll make these concessions? That doesn't really stand to reason as a verifiable process, if you will, right? And so, you know, for the opposition, the key really was reforming the Electoral Council, the CNE. Without having that change, it was going to be very difficult for them to think about creating a level or some type of competitive election for this process. And on your question about transitional justice, I don't have a crystal ball about the likelihood of these factors, but there is a recognition, I think, within some sectors of the Venezuelan opposition that eventually you do need to find a way to live with Chavismo. There's obviously a public line within some parts of the opposition which was highly critical of Santos's peace deal, right? And you would sort of draw from that they're unlikely to support transitional justice, but they don't necessarily represent the whole, you know, opposition, which is highly heterogeneous, and it's not clear who's going to make it to power. And any type of power situation, for it to be sustainable, in my view, is going to have to be as encompassing as possible. So I think there's likely to be some type of transitional justice. It may not be called that. If you look at Venezuela's own political history, they didn't have formal transitional justice, but they did pacify their guerrilla forces and bring them into the fold. So if you want to think about the own country's background, you could say that there is, in fact, some level of a history of reconciliation within the country. This is a different period, don't get me wrong, but let's also keep that historical context in mind for how the transition from the Pérez Jiménez dictatorship to democracy worked, and how the pacification of left-wing guerrillas also worked, which were actively supported by Fidel Castro, right? It wasn't just any guerrilla group. They were, you know, Fidel actually invaded, right? So quite significant. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I mean, just to start with Jeff's question on April 23rd. I mean, I think the elections are probably going to go forward. I think the key is going to be this issue of non-recognition. I think it's not entirely what that is going to mean, that a president is not recognized. I think that diplomats have to think this through, and it should be communicated before the election. I think it's something that is an important tool. I think it's the most important obstacle for the government, but it's not exactly clear what it's going to actually mean in movement or when it's actually implemented. And I think that needs to be made clear. In terms of the military, I think it's so hard to actually say anything about the military that's anything other than speculative. And there's always rumors floating around. The most recent iteration of a rumor that I will identify as a rumor is that there's a lot of discontent at the lower levels, that the current economic crisis means that only the upper levels are really getting the goods, that there's all kinds of people that have abandoned the service in the lower levels, and that there is considerable discontent in the mid-levels and lower levels, and that is leading to some rumblings and some rumors of coups. The fact that people in our government were mentioning this in the recent weeks, I think oftentimes is some indication of some intelligence that they have. For some reason, they think that's an important thing to say right now. And so, there's that. But I could have said this. I could have said this probably, at any time in the past 5 years. So it's not something I focus on a whole lot, just because it's so hard to get quality information. As far as migrants, I think that this is an important element of the current political context. I think the more people that migrate, which are absolutely over-selected for people that oppose the government, the easier it is for this government to consolidate. I don't actually know. Presidential elections, can people outside of the country vote? I know they can't in regional elections and legislative.
I mean, they should be able to. They should be able.
They can vote. Yeah. So in that sense, maybe it's not as big of a deal for a presidential election. We'd have to see actually what that actually means in practice. But in general, as was the case in Cuba, it certainly provides a relief valve for the Maduro government to have so many people leaving the country. in terms of positive engagement, I think, how likely is this? Well, that is a really difficult thing, and I don't necessarily focus on it because I think it's likely. I focus on it because I think it's the only possible way to have a positive outcome. I think, the Maduro government's plans are an authoritarian consolidation. I think they want to consolidate a government, and I think if they can get through the next couple of years, they can consolidate their political control. Eventually, there'd be turnover, and presidential and presidents and administrations, and some governments would end up saying, "Oh, well, it's better to have positive relations with Venezuela," and they would get through that, and they could consolidate. The other sort of extreme is some sort of really undesirable type transition that could be really messy and violent. I think the only way you can imagine a positive movement to a less undesirable equilibrium than what we currently have is through some sort of transition that would be electoral, involve international mediation, and some kind of transitional justice. I think that's the one way you can imagine. How likely is this? Well, I'll tell you, my very first term paper as an undergraduate student just a couple of years ago was before Jeff was born. Basically had the thesis that the Northern Ireland conflict was unsolvable, and I thought I hit a home run with that. And I was right for like 15 years, and that it was indeed. I said because the conflicts are so deep, there's so much resentment, and it's religious in the end. This is not a resolvable conflict. Lo and behold, it actually was. It's not that there's not resentments, and not that there's not conflicts, but they've gotten to a less undesirable equilibrium, and they've come to a sort of détente, and they can kind of live together. Same thing goes for South Africa. Same thing goes for any number of contexts. Yugoslavia, was a terrible process, but in the end, well, now they're sort of living in peace. And so that's the way I think about Venezuela. Likely in the next 6 months, I think it's unlikely. But at some time in the future, I think it's entirely possible, entirely probable, and something to work for that I'm willing to work for the next 5, 10, 15 years, whatever it takes.
Hi, my name is Nicholas, and I'm from the University of Toronto in the Wilson Center. And I have 2 questions, all interrelated. So I'm thinking about your idea of a transitional justice. And if you look at the Southern Cone countries, for example, when they transitioned out of dictatorship, with the exception of Argentina, you had pacts with the military, which basically said, we'll give you democracy, but don't, go against us for human rights abuses. And we know in Venezuela that certainly human rights abuses happening by the government, right? So do you think the opposition would be willing to just let that go the same way? Is there a credible threat for another coup against the opposition government, for example? And the other thing that I think is mitigating against this idea is transnational justice, right? So even if it's the case that within Venezuela, they are likely to say, okay, fine, we will accept this transitional justice, we'll forgive you, etc. The international community could say, excuse me, but there's international human rights abuses. It doesn't matter what your political compromise is, and that's also very different from the transitions in the 80s. So I'm wondering if you can talk to that. And just one brief other thing. I'm also wondering, is there anybody to talk to that will actually have the power to make these decisions inside the regime? Right? So is it the military? Is it who are you talking to that can actually implement this?
Let's see a hand in the back. Yeah.
So I'm Jeff Pugh. I teach conflict resolution at UMass Boston and also have a regional peace center in Ecuador. So I've been talking a lot with Venezuelans coming into Ecuador. And on the migration question, since that's my area, I've noticed also this drastic increase recently. Previously, Venezuelans were a negligible portion of the people coming in, and just in the last year or two, they're up to 20% almost of the asylum seekers. So I'm seeing that. I've heard people saying, talking about registering to vote and doing that. I wonder then, maybe for both of you, David, you talk more about the transnational linkages in your presentation, but I know Mike, you've also thought about this. What kind of structure, network structure, could we imagine that would link some of the things you're talking about, where activists are being pushed out of the country, so they're often, talking to each other, working on the problem from outside of the country, still very much engaged, and the diplomatic efforts. So, when I was at UNASUR in the last year or two, they were all in crisis mode over Venezuela. They were talking about the mediation efforts that you mentioned, David. The Catholic Church, I know, has been involved in that Mesa as well, with sort of mixed levels of success, mixed to not very much so far. So I'm interested how all this can put pressure towards a carrot of some sort, right? What can this structure between activists abroad and the transnational resources they are able to mobilize and pressure, and those institutions that, at least David, you said were the key. Can we get all of Latin America to mobilize around, Maduro, either work with the National Assembly, or you're not going to be invited to any more Summit of the Americas, we're going to suspend diplomatic relations or whatever. Can we imagine a scenario or specific strategies, actually, that Venezuelans abroad can use their connections with those institutions, that the institutions can design, so there isn't the exit clause that you talked about? I can imagine ways to put pressure, but can you think of how to channel it towards a choice that the government can understand?
Let's fix it up. Why don't you?
Okay. In terms of your question, I think we are, and I think this is sort of the premise of your question. I think we're in a different era than the transitions from authoritarian governments in the Southern Cone. I think that kind of sort of blanket amnesty was questionable at that time, didn't last, and I think at this time it would be even more questionable. I mean, that said, there are transition programs. The Colombia Peace Accord is based on a transition program, and of course it's not uncontroversial, as you know, and that's why it got put back at the polls. And so all of these things, end up, the most basic dilemma is one between peace versus justice. No? But the art of it is to try and make those things work together. I mean, that's what artful diplomacy and transitional justice can do. I think that's what it starts with, recognizing that dilemma and not trying to go to one of the extremes, but trying to artfully try to maximize and create value with what you have there. In terms of who to talk to, I mean, I think actually the power brokers in Venezuela are quite clear. I mean, of course, Maduro is the president, and he actually has quite a bit more power than people think. He's often presented as just kind of this front for real power brokers, but it's not actually true. He actually has quite a bit of power and is politically able, and so he is quite important. Behind him, the Rodriguez siblings, Delcy Rodriguez and her brother are, I think, some of the main sort of minds in the government right now. Diosdado Cabello, of course, has a big following, is important, and of course the military is a bad actor. Anything is going to have to involve those people. In terms of this is an important question. The question about what kind of international network can actually develop. In fact, there is an institutionality that we have. There's the OAS, the United Nations. There's all these multilateral agencies. But of course, those are very difficult. It's very difficult to come up with solutions. We saw what happened in the OAS last year. It was not even really possible to come up with any kind of rebuke to Venezuela. Didn't get the votes, and a lot of that has the structure as a result of the structure of the OAS. United Nations, is very hard to get anything past the Security Council, in which China and Russia have seats on, and so that's why I think oftentimes these things end up getting solved by groups of friends. I mean, that's what happened with the Central American conflict. It wasn't a multinational institution. It was a group of interested countries that came together and put forward a plausible plan, and they were stakeholders and they were interested. Same thing has happened, I think, with the Colombian conflict. And so I think we've actually seen some progress on that in this past year. After the OAS failed, after we had the Constituent Assembly, the Group of Lima appeared. And so far what they've done is just meet and make proclamations. But actually, that's not right. They actively supported the negotiations, and so I think this effort at mediation, and the idea that each side could choose sort of 3 countries to accompany them, that was huge progress. And I think this round of discussions were much better, even if they were ultimately unsuccessful. So it was much better. In terms of sort of other transnational resources, I say this, with some lament, because I personally, my social network is Venezuelan expat, expat networks. I spend a lot of my time in Venezuela, a lot of my time in the U.S., and most of the people I spend my time with are Venezuelans. And so I don't think that that's necessarily the best resource. In the same way, if you think about the conflict between the United States and Cuba, I don't think the Cuban if you move from your country and you have to move, it generates a series of commitments and discourses and emotions that I think are hard to reconcile with a really active role in some sort of transitional type process. I think oftentimes you have to have some stakeholders. I think the Lima group is a nice group of stakeholders. I think it would be really great to have some sort of European country playing the role that Norway played. In the Colombia, some country that has a distinguished tradition of being progressive and being independent that could come in and play a role. I think the Netherlands is an interesting possibility. I think there's still a role for the United Nations to play. I think something coming through the Security Council is probably not likely, but I think there's still space for Secretary General Gutierrez to name some sort of special representative. I think that could have some influence. The United Nations is one body that Venezuela, for the most part, still respects. And so, I think it's not going to appear overnight. It's not something that pre-exists. It's something that has to be constructed step by step, and unfortunately, it takes a long time. But I think that's where a positive solution could come from. Is some sort of international coalition that sees itself as having an interest and desire to help developing a solution.
Yeah, so I'll work backwards from Jeff's question to the front. So I think if I understood your question, you are sort of searching for more insights about current activities surrounding efforts to coordinate international sort of humanitarian assistance or return of migrants. I wasn't fully sure what you're asking about, but what I would say is that you need to think about it on a couple of levels at least, and that is that arguably the first thing to do is to alleviate suffering for migrant populations, Venezuelan migrant populations outside of the country now, at least for those who are in the group that we would describe as the dispossessed, right? Because it is a economically diverse population when you look at the whole hemisphere. So that's one area of immediate engagement, and it's one way in which international communities can immediately make an impact. And in fact, the U.S. has struggled with the idea of how to provide humanitarian assistance. There's been many efforts to try and engage the Venezuelan government via bilateral and also via church groups and so on and so forth. And there are some multilateral efforts that are ongoing. But one idea that came up in the context of the recent trip was for there to be support for Venezuelan migrants abroad, or refugees in other countries. And that may be something that the region begins to ask for because of the fact that they need to stabilize conditions because of governance crises that local government is facing on the border with Venezuela, right, and so on and so forth. And likewise, the state of Roraima in Brazil declared an emergency last year, right? So there are sort of near-term things that can be done, I think, if the region sort of coordinates those activities and works with not only the U.S. but also the UN and other sorts of organizations along those lines. And then, in an ideal scenario, right, of sort of linear progress, that would provide a type of platform for next steps in terms of thinking about, does this population want to return? David's raised the question of, well, they may be thinking about a different scenario once they're outside of Venezuela. But it's a very diverse population, right, that we're talking about, right? In Colombia, it's between 500,000 and 1 million. In the U.S., it's a growing population. Likewise, in Peru and Brazil, and the Caribbean, we should also mention. So It's hard to figure out what to do in terms of reinsertion of this population back into the country. But I would start with immediate, efforts to alleviate suffering for that population. That's one way to directly address the effects of the crisis in Latin America before it becomes a fully destabilizing problem. I agree with your overall assessment. There are completely new challenges for thinking about transitional justice. Remember that most of those transitions also took place, the Southern Cone transitions took place still during the Cold War, right? So I mean, that just even at that level, it's a completely different ballgame. And then in addition to sort of efforts, at the International Criminal Court to look into torture and persecution of the opposition in the context of the protests last year, that's one part of it. Then there's also the possibility that there could be some type of, international commission against corruption and human rights abuses in Venezuela, something along what we've seen, along the lines of what we've seen in Central America, and that's something else that would be considered. Linking back with an earlier point about transitional justice, my understanding is that the way that a lot of people in the opposition are thinking about it is that first you're going to have to reform the judiciary. Okay, so the biggest problem in Venezuela is the fact that almost no judge has the equivalent of tenure. Right? So they're all basically in a completely politically precarious situation. So before you can really begin to talk about justice, there's going to have to be a comprehensive rule of law reform, and that level of change, I think, may be the starting point for any of these bigger conversations about how to accomplish transitional justice. And that may just be a political reality. It may not be the best thing from the perspective of, like David said, finding the artful balance between peace and justice, but it may be at the level of feasibility what has to happen first, so to speak. Thank you.
I think we've got time for one more round. I know I saw at least one hand in the back again. Just state your name, any affiliations, and your question.
John Walsh, and I have a question. I'm going to pair the non-recognition issue with the oil issue. And I think if you think of the government as planning to somehow muddle through the economic crisis and stabilize, it still has a lot of oil under its soil. And the idea of non-recognition may be firm line at the outset, imagining from what the Venezuelan government see it, but something that might crumble over time as governments realize that this is a potential source of oil for us if we have a relationship, particularly for a government that's going to be squeezed by others. So in terms of the sort of layers that non-recognition of the government might take, and the sort of ace in the hole, as it were, that Venezuela may have in terms of something that other countries do want, if the market's right, is, I think, one of those layers that would need to be thought through very clearly so that there's not just a sense of, all right, this non-recognition thing will only last so long, and then we're going to, winnow that down, and we're going to be able to endure until people just get used to us. So the question then is, what are those likely markets? Because the oil industry today is not what it was 10 years ago in terms of the U.S. becoming an exporter. So in terms of where Venezuela would look, Mike, maybe this is the question for you. What would those countries be with this big question?
Sure. So I was hoping to ask two quick questions, one about sanctions, one about media. So you both mentioned sanctions and kind of being skeptical of their effectiveness in regards to Venezuela. I think there's a lot of academic literature that would be equally skeptical, primarily because of some of the negative externalities that occur when you apply sanctions. So thinking about that in Venezuela, the government is now looking for ways to kind of subvert the economic impacts that occur from these sanctions being applied. And as I'm sure many in this room are aware, that the Venezuelan government has some significant connections with criminal organizations. And I'm wondering how you think that sanctions would increase or affect these relationships. Have we seen an uptick in criminal activity? Can we expect the government to be more permissive of this type of stuff? And regarding media, you mentioned that the Venezuelan government is winning the communication battle regarding sanctions. And so I've also heard from others in the Venezuelan expat community and experts that there's a new law being introduced about an anti-hate speech law that is sort of in a double-think fashion, allowing the government to, under the guise of providing equal protection of speech to people, actually cracking down on the media. So I'm wondering if you think that, why are they winning? Is it that the government is actually a very intelligent, Orwellian intelligentsia, or is it that the opposition is just so fractured they don't have a palpable response to really combat the information coming out of the government?
Yeah.
So I'm with the National Democratic Institute. I just wanted to follow up on the issue of participation and what are the pros and cons of opposition on April 22nd, and also what does it mean for the potential further fracturing of the opposition in a post-electoral environment.
So, yeah, I'll work backwards again. So I think that this is something of a big statement from my perspective. This is the first time that I've thought that there is a scenario in which I would support an opposition decision to not participate. And that's because of the fact that there is a greater good than there arguably is a greater good than participation in this election, and that is opposition unity. So if the cost of participation is fracturing of the opposition, then I could see a scenario in which it makes sense for them to not participate. Again, it's a strategic question. It's not so much the legitimacy issue. I think that the opposition has itself been surprised at how difficult it has been to come to a consensus about what to do regarding this vote. But this has been their perpetual problem. What is the plan B when things don't go well on plan A? Now there is a pretext for them to not participate, given the non-recognition and the fact that the National Constituent Assembly was really the organization that sort of started this process for calling for there to be an election before April 30th. They have a number of issues to consider there. I think it's still possible that there is opposition participation. Yesterday, I think it was that the leader of Democratic Action, Henry Ramos, said that he would only participate, or there should only be opposition participation if it's supported by the entire coalition. And that is, partially about positioning. He's positioning himself vis-a-vis another potential opposition or quote opposition candidate, Henry Falcon. But I think it is an important principle to keep in mind that there is a greater good, which is opposition unity there. So coming to the great questions about media, and also the you observed that I sounded skeptical about sanctions. So let me hit both of those. So I don't know if I would use the same words as David about the government winning the communications war, because it's difficult for them not to win. The opposition doesn't any longer have what you would call fair access to media. There isn't freedom of the press in Venezuela. There's no rule of law. At the same time, I think that Maduro has actually done a good job in responding to the sanctions, which is not to say the same thing that he's winning, okay? But they have done a good job of trying to play the victim card, which is what they've done traditionally. And also, there has been some resonance behind the government's messaging that this is a bloqueo, okay? That the sanctions on new debt, or the prohibition on new debt, is in fact a bloqueo financiero. And I've even heard Latin American politicians utter that, right? They've called it a bloqueo, and they may just be using that term synonymously for talking about sanctions, but there are some positive effects from the government's messaging on this front, and that may play into the broader history of U.S.-Latin American relations. But the opposition doesn't really have a way to get its message out, and then its message is also very weak. So it's a combination of factors, but I think it's important to keep both pieces of context in mind. I'm skeptical about sanctions in the sense that we need to keep an open mind about the fact that sometimes there are benefits to them and sometimes there are costs to them. In that sense, I am skeptical. But it is notable that the United States so far has actually calibrated the escalation of sanction pressure. Okay, they've left room for there to be reassessment of each round of sanctions, and they're moving up the ladder of escalation, I think, gradually. That, I think, is arguably a positive development because it means they're thinking about their decisions in the context of what's taking place in country. Right? You don't want to be too far out in front necessarily of what's going on within the opposition and within the country itself. Connecting to sanctions and the question about participation, one reason to defend participation is that when the opposition is there, raising the costs of fraud for the government, it creates a stronger basis of legitimacy for sanctioning the government, right? That is to say, now it's clear why we need to condemn this government and why it needs also to be penalized in some fashion, right? Without opposition participation, the argument in favor of sanctions is arguably weakened, right? So there are a number of different calculations that need to be kept in mind there. And John, your question about the relationship between non-recognition and oil sanctions, are you saying we don't want to get ourselves into a situation in which Venezuela becomes a corporatist, capitalist, authoritarian state, and we don't recognize what they do politically, but we look the other way when multinationals invest? Is that kind of your question? I couldn't fully.
I think what I'm saying is, in terms of what non-recognition may imply, in fact, for how governments relate to Venezuela, and Venezuela's plausible goal of muddling through the economic crisis until things stabilize, realizing that they still have a bunch of oil under the ground that the country will want to buy.
Right.
At some point. That could erode the impact, even if there is a positive one,
right,
of non-recognition. And
yeah.
So what looking at the holes that might exist
sure.
from the outset in non-recognition, how would that likely play in the government's favor is my question. And
gotcha.
My guess is that that's how they're thinking. We're going to weather this storm
yeah.
and muddle through, and then people are going to get used to who we are, and in no small part because we have something that they want.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, there are inherent challenges to pressuring an oil state, right? And those are very big challenges. The production is way down, right, in the oil sector, but they're still sending around 1 million or less barrels to cashable exports, right? So that's enough to keep a regime standing, arguably, like you're suggesting, right? So the problem does need to be thought of in terms of the political economic model of the country as well as the sort of regime type question. Good point. Thank you.
Okay, so just taking the same questions. This first one about whether an oil or whether the decline in oil, whether the financial sanctions is simply leading to an uptick in illicit economies. I mean, this is something that I've seen this on the web as well and different claims. For me, I haven't seen anything that goes that's not speculative, and I'm always suspicious about these things because what we hear continually is if you start with the assumption that there are many people that want international intervention in Venezuela, then there is a premium on information that will suggest that this is a threatening rogue state. So whether it is missile silos in the Paraguay Peninsula, or false passports in the hands of terrorists, or illicit economies that now are arising, there's an interest behind a lot of these rumors. So until I see some actual data, I'm not going to pay too much attention to that. It has a certain logic to it. You can't get your money from oil, so let's get it from drugs. I think that in the end, it doesn't make too much sense because the people that are at that level are still benefiting. The people that are paying the costs are the population, and they're not involved in that kind of illicit economy. No, I think the military generals and the different people in the state that have their hands in food corruption are still doing quite well with that, and I think they will for the foreseeable future, even if things go down. I mean, they're still in the best position of anybody, and so I don't really think that there's the idea of this uptick in illicit economies because of this is really the way that they're going to get around sanctions. They undoubtedly are actors like everyone else, and they're going to find their way around sanctions. That's what they're going to spend their time thinking about doing, but I just don't think that's the direction they're going to go. And that could be a segue to John's question about oil. Yeah, I think that's exactly, I would repeat what Mike said. I think that's exactly what they're thinking, and it's hard to sanction or hard to pressure an oil state because they have so many alternatives. And I do think it's going to be a very serious difficulty for them, especially not just selling crude to the U.S., but not getting light crude from the United States. I think it's going to be, and other refined products, I think it's going to be a difficult thing, and not using their network of refineries. I think all of those will be very difficult. But in the end, they'll find a way. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I think ISIS actually got its oil on the international market, at some point. And so if you have this valuable substance, somehow you're going to get it on the market. And I think that's going to help them, stumble through this, and I think that's what they're thinking. In the end, we're so valuable, and in the end, countries tire of this, and so we'll get recognized further down the road at some point. In terms of the media, my saying that the Maduro government is winning the communications battle on this. I actually was not thinking of the Maduro government versus the opposition, because I don't think that this is an opposition thing. I was saying that the Maduro government is beating the international community in terms of communications. The different countries and groups that are sanctioning do not have a clear communications strategy on this. And so, specifically in the case of the United States, which has these debt sanctions, I mean, they just kind of rolled them out. At one point, there was some sort of oblique mention by someone in Treasury or State that they can get around if they go to the National Assembly, but there's been no real clear media campaign compared to, Maduro's bully pulpit on steroids, in the international media. And so I think, the sanctions don't come from the opposition. I don't think the opposition should spend its time talking about them a whole lot. I don't think they should be associated with them because it's not really their battle. I think in terms of the media more broadly, I think it's important to realize that, this is not North Korea. This is not an absolute police state where people get no information. I mean, this is a wired country. That people have access to the internet. That's very slow these days, but it's incredible the access people have with Twitter. It's incredible the number with the decline of print newspapers, the number of web portals that actually do information and cover. This will probably be covered somewhere today in a web portal in Venezuela. And so people, and it's impressive how many people have smartphones and have access. So there is information. Basically. There's a lot of self-censorship in, for example, Globovisión, Unión Radio, El Universal, but it's specific. They're not going to cover things that they think could get out of control, so they don't cover live events. That's a very serious limitation for the opposition. But what they do is they interview opposition leaders all the time. Globovisión, you probably turn it on right now. You probably have an opposition leader. Unión Radio, so they can get their message out. And I think that a concerted effort. I think it just doesn't occur to international countries. I mean, with the exception, I think the European Union immediately, when they talked about sanctions, talked about how people could get out from under them. So I think that they had that a little bit in mind. But I think everyone could do a much better job of that. In terms of participating or not on April 22nd, I think that, I would agree with Mike. I think that there's good reasons to participate. There's good reasons to not participate, and I think you can see how both of these strategies can fail by what happened in October and December. In October, they tried to go to elections, and they didn't do what they needed to do to actually get their people to turn out. And of course, the CNE, the Electoral Council, and the government did a lot to try and get people to stay home, and they ended up losing the elections. That's how the participation strategy can fail. That's probably what would happen if they participate. In December, they abstained, but then a whole bunch of other sort of loose ends candidates ran, and the optics of that were basically neutral, and they just lost a whole lot of space at the level of municipalities. So that, if they don't participate, that's probably what's going to happen. I mean, what I think the real issue is unity. No, they could make either of those strategies work. You could go to elections and have a clear communications campaign, say these elections are unfair, they should not be recognized, but we're going to participate as a protest vote, and rally all your people and say, go out there and protest and vote, and then hang out in the streets and say, we voted and we reject this government. That could work, and you know, the numbers are there that if they actually got convinced everybody to do that, they would probably win the election. On the other hand, in abstention, if they really mobilized and got everybody on board that they're not going to participate in this election, that these elections are not possible given the short time frame, that the conditions aren't there, their candidates are disqualified, and got everybody on board and had active abstention, I think that could be a really powerful sign to the international community that these elections are not legitimate. And I think that could be, you know, that could be really difficult for the government. But both of those strategies depend on whether they can actually get people to unify behind them, and that's going to take leadership. It's going to take communications, which is something that they haven't really shown in the past 8 months. So they, you know, I think you can't hit the opposition too hard. I think they have had good moments. 2015, I thought they did a good job in putting together a coalition for the elections. I thought they did a good job last year in organizing and coordinating protests, and they did a great job with the referendum that they held, the informal referendum. They can coordinate, they can message, no, but they've got to make it happen together, despite all the pressure they're being put on by the government.
All right, well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for our audience for the great questions. We will be following this issue very closely, and I invite you all to check out our work on the blog and the Venezuelan politics and human rights blog that we have. Thank you.
Thank you.